Welcome to another episode of From the Grassroots, a podcast about those who have made and preserved African American history in Alabama. My name is Justin Rudder, and before I introduce my guest, I'd like to talk for a minute about the monumental events. In addition to the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests throughout the nation, we lost several influential civil rights leaders, including C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, and Charles Evers, who was the brother of Medgar Evers, who was the first NAACP field secretary in Mississippi and killed in front of his home by a white supremacist. In this time of loss in July 2020, it's important that unity outweigh division, and there are simple solutions to this. As discussed in my last talk with Decatur historian Peggy Towns, black and white in telling the complicated histories of our past. Whether it's poster board or a well-endowed museum, it does not cost much to turn discussions about our past into public recognition. Today I'm talking with a white ally to preserve African American history throughout the 20th century. Dr. Alan Jones grew up in Andalusia in South Alabama, took part in integrating troops at Tuskegee Institute during the Korean War, and taught in the history department at Auburn University from 1960, where he not only became the first archivist of the university, but also assisted in the integration of the faculty and organizations like the Alabama Historical Association. So it is very much my pleasure to introduce my guest, Dr. Alan Jones. How are you doing, Dr. Jones?
Fine, Justin. I'm glad to contribute to your project. It sounds good.
Well, thank you.
I fought for what you're looking for a long time.
Yes, sir.
Let me start by telling you, and I come from the Wiregrass section of Covington County, which is right down on the Florida line, and it was a white county. Well, very few slaves there, and so very few blacks. And when I came along, it was the Ku Klux Klan was in popularity, and my father, he supported the Klan, but I don't think he was ever a member. But there were very few blacks there, and it was basically the old South. There was no integration of anything, and so I grew up in a closed society as a boy, and never. But the interesting thing is, I was raised by a little black young lady named Rebecca, who my parents, of course, during the 30s, all had to work. I was born in 1930. They had to work, so they had a maid. What she did, looked after me from 1930 probably to 1936, 37. And Rebecca, and she was black, and I loved her. She was almost like a mama to me, but I didn't know anything wrong with that. I was supposed to. She was looking after me, and So I grew up liking her and not hating black people, because I didn't really understand all of that, to being a child. But that's my life in an area, because all the blacks were up in the black belt, where the black people were.
Okay.
And so I came from a kind of closed society, and it was not until I came to Auburn University in 1948, I was a freshman here, and began to study history and read books, that I realized that someone was wrong with our society. I didn't come up from Covington County disliking blacks. And I thought, well, there's something wrong with this. And because my father, as I say, was a George Wallace campaign, was a George Wallace campaign man, and took me up to Montgomery as a young fellow to meet him and so forth.
Wow.
But I never supported George Wallace and his segregation. So I was a rarity in Covington County, but I left Covington County in 1948 and never went back. My father ran the newspaper there.
Okay.
And he died born a racist and died a racist. And so that's where I come from. So it's interesting that I would change so, and I thought it's interesting that I would change so, and I attribute really education to the first step of my wanting to get to know and to free black people from the Jim Crow laws. I could tell real quick these things from the Jim Crow laws. I could tell real quick these things were bad. They were wrong. They were, and so as a teacher, of course, I spoke out against the poll tax, and I spoke out against all of these things. As a teacher, I'm sure I hope I influenced a lot of young people. I think after I finished my degree here my master's in 1953, I went in during the Korea War. I was drafted and went.
Well, before you go any further, I just wanted to just kind of expound on just a couple of things. My grandparents were, it was a different time, I guess, sort of a different mentality. And I think as it evolves, I don't know, it's where just you hear these things coming up like I'm to the table, and I'm learning all the time about these people that have made such a difference, both black and white, and just trying to talk to them. And the thing is, we're all at fault, and just once we can admit that and get past it, it's
Look, there's hundreds of thousands of people that can't.
Yeah.
They can't get past it, and that's why our problem lingers today.
Yes,
These people harbored this Jim Crow South, and they still support it. And it's a lack of morality. It's a lack of knowledge and information that drives most of them, and greed and selfishness and wanting to exploit somebody, and particularly take advantage of them economically and so forth. So it's the kind of thing that I've watched change, and of course the people I surround myself with, and all of my children. I have 3 children, and so forth. So, that's one contribution I made to society, was to bring up children who thought like I did and who recognized the cruelty of what was being done to black people. So that's important to understand, I think.
Details. You said a lady named Rebecca kind of helped raise you. What was her last name?
I don't remember. All I know is isn't that interesting? You didn't call them. You just called them by their first names. It was almost it was almost bad to try to call their whole name. I mean, they were just a name, Rebecca, and that was all I knew.
Okay, and well, and that's fine. It's like we say. And that's fine. It's like we say. It's amazing how times change, and it's like I say. My grandfather, and my grandmother, they were kind people. I don't think it was a complicated time, but never. It was a complicated time, but nevertheless, they did, the N-word was used and different things like that. But I think
see, they were born during the segregation era. My parents were born in the segregation era. My parents were born in 1905. The height of the Jim Crow laws and the 1901 Alabama Constitution, and they came out of an era when all of this was important, and the putting blacks down and then the putting blacks down and in their place was the thing for everybody to do, even United States senators and so forth. So it's a thing that I think people need to understand today, that it's something that was embedded in our society after Reconstruction, and the political situation changed into a group of people who used that as a springboard for power in politics. And that's sad, but that's the way it was. and the people of Alabama and the people of the South, you have a problem, because it was not only in the South, it went to the North too, but the South predominantly was the area. Yes, but let me say this, one of the things that I think made me realize problems, I was drafted in 1953 and ended up serving 38 years in the Army Reserves and retired as a full colonel in 1990. So I was a commanding officer of troops I was there when the armed forces were integrated, and we had blacks. I was an ambulance company commander in the 11th Airborne Division, and in Germany for 3 years. And I had half of my unit were blacks, Afro-Americans, and I got to know them well. They were my friends. They were my soldiers. And this made a lot of difference in my life, which a lot of people did not have. So there are a lot of things that changed, but I thought there are a lot of things that changed, but I think when I realized the time to really influence things was after I got my degree and was teaching. I'll tell you, one of my first experiences, I taught the first black student at Furman University.
Wow.
I taught 6 years at Furman University.
Wow.
I taught 6 years at Furman from 60 to 66. And I had a guy named Joe, and he was the only black student there, and he was a delightful young fella, and we became the best of friends, and we had all kind of racial jokes, best of friends, and we had all kind of racial jokes. We laughed and talked, and I could tell you some funny stories, but anyway, he was a big influence on me and the students there. He went on, he's dead now. He died back in, I think in the 1980s or 90s.
Oh.
And then the next step is, what do you do to change this, and what do you do to influence things? And that's when I came to Auburn, I really had a chance to do something, and that's when I took off. I taught black history for a number of years, agricultural records of some kind of related to Auburn, because they needed to go to the Black Institution of Tuskegee. So when I came back to Auburn in '66, I went to Tuskegee and joined a reserve unit down there, a mobile Army hospital. It was all black. I was the only one to integrate and live in a black society when you're white back in 1960. And this was bad times. And when I came to Auburn, the head of the newspaper here was a friend of mine. I had worked for him as a student and he knew I was pretty liberal, so he appointed me to the school board.
Wow.
And I was one of the champions that helped integrate the schools in Auburn. We voted to combine the black schools and the white schools. That was one of my first achievements, was to speak up for that. It was 1966 67 or 68, somewhere right there, and so that was a turning point. But that was a turning point. But my getting to know people at Tuskegee, the blacks down there, the doctors and the nurses, and the people at the university, and some of the professors. This was really an eye opener, and I became most best friends with the archivist at Tuskegee Institute, which they had a wonderful archives. Lacked money, and it needed a lot of work and so forth. But Danny Williams was his name, and we became the best of friends. And he would come up to Auburn and with me, and we'd go over to the cafeteria and eat together. We became the best of friends for the rest of his life until he left Tuskegee. He would come. He was the funniest guy. He would, race didn't seem to bother him, and it didn't bother us, and it was just like he was one of the family.
Yes, sir.
And that made a difference, I think.
Wow.
And but what I said is, if I find Tuskegee, I think this ought to be the center where you've got already so much stuff about blacks. I mean, he had all Booker T. Washington stuff, George Washington Carver stuff. Oh my God, it's just a magnificent archive. You ought to go down there sometimes.
Oh, yes,
and the
sir.
guy who's running it now is a white guy who's one of the students to the archives. You ought to go down there and visit that.
Oh yeah, Dana Chandler.
It's a very interesting
Yes, sir.
place, and so I recommend that. But anyway, I did a lot to help Danny. I became interested in a black man there called Thomas M. Campbell. His son was a colonel that ran. He was a doctor that ran the reserve unit that I was in, and it was his daddy what I was in. And it was his daddy was named Thomas M. Campbell, and he was the first black agricultural agent in the South.
Wow.
The first person that was appointed from Washington in 1906. Appointed from Washington in 1906. And he served until 1956. And I just about finished a biography of him. I published several articles about him and Tuskegee and all about the education of black farmers and a great education of black farmers and a great deal of that. But the key, the thing where I really scored 100%. was I told Danny I would like to have some of my graduate students work on things about Tuskegee. And he said, let's work on things about Tuskegee. And he said, well, that's wonderful. He said, none of the professors here at Tuskegee are interested at all in all of this material we have and do anything, and I would. So my first student, one of my first students, was a young lady that I talked into going to graduate science, but she's later called Linda McMurray.
Okay.
And I said, I want you to write, nobody has written a really great biography of George Washington Carver. And so she took up, and she published. Well, first she wrote a master's thesis, and Monroe Work, who was a sociologist, professor at Tuskegee, a big a man that Booker T. Washington recruited and brought from the University of Chicago to Tuskegee. Washington had a knack for talking people and bright black people who had graduated from Northern University to come to Tuskegee Institute. And while he went out and raised money and did all kind of things, these people ran the university. And this guy was a professor there and published a Negro yearbook. I don't forget you've never seen. I have a Negro yearbook. I don't forget you've never seen. I have a whole set of it that Danny gave me. They had all these called a Negro Yearbook.
Oh, yes,
And
sir.
it started in 1906, I believe they started, or 12, 13. I got them all out of my 12, 13. I got them all out of my garage out there, and they went on into the 1940s, 45, 46, published about every 3 to 4 years.
Wow.
And it's Monroe work collected things about blacks all over the United States. Statistics. If you've never seen one of the Negro history yearbooks, you've missed something.
Why?
And they're very rare, very rare. And I have a collection of them that Danny had many of them, copies, and so he gave me copies of all of them. And I don't know what will happen. State Archives.
Oh, yes, sir. I wanted to quickly interject. I actually, I wrote an article on Monroe work for the Encyclopedia of Alabama, and where I got most of my information was introduced to the Negro Yearbook was through Linda McMurray's.
Yeah, and she's retired now.
Wow.
And so that was her first thing, and she did a magnificent job. And as I say, it was so good that the University of Georgia Press published it, and I was glad because this was that whole thing is an interesting story, as you well know if you wrote something about it. The Oxford University Press published in it must have been 1980, somewhere along there. I forget the date. I got copies of all these things, and but it won all kind of prizes and so forth. And later on, she taught at State.
Wow.
After that, she published a book that we had talked about sometime. Ida B. Wells, the black lady who was the journalist, newspaper editor. Are you familiar with Ida B.
yes,
Wells?
sir. Yes, sir. In Memphis. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, she wrote her.
Wow.
And but she also wrote. She did something else interesting. She wrote a children's book on George Washington Carver.
Huh.
It's just for children, and I had. She gave me a copy of it, but I gave it to my grandson.
Okay.
When he was coming along years ago, because when he was coming along years ago, because I said I don't have any need for this, and I want you to have it, and I took my grandson to Tuskegee, and Danny Williams gave him all kind of things on black history and so forth, and so and other students. I had another student who wrote a history of the National Negro Business League.
Wow.
Let's see, what else? Oh gosh, I can't remember. People. It was my graduate students who worked on Afro-American history. That was kind of my contribution. And one of my students published a copy on blacks in Reconstruction, Alabama. The first thing it had written about these black politicians who were elected during Reconstruction in Alabama.
Wow.
So I talked students into working into black history, and of course I published. Me and a black student, a black professor at Clemson, we met and we did a book. We did 2 books. We did a book on the black press in the South, and we all about 12 of us did. I did Alabama, and they did Mississippi and all these states, and Georgia and so forth. So a real contribution. I think that was published in 1979 or 80, and then we published another one called "The Black Press Did States in the Midwest," and I did the chapter on Iowa, and found a newspaper out there that had been published and is still being published today. And nobody had ever even recognized it. It was all in a black family. And so these kind of things, and I published things about it and so forth. These were things that I did.
Yes, sir.
Plus, of course, at Auburn, trying to convert students from racist into human beings.
Wow.
My contribution to society. You have to work hard at that. Let me tell you, Justin.
Yes, sir.
It's been a struggle, and let me tell you about. I became friends with a. We hired. Let me tell you about. I became friends with a. We hired the first black professor, and he was from Tuskegee Institute. I knew him. I'd met him down there. His name was Robert Reed.
Okay.
He taught down there for years and years, about 20 years or so. He'd been there a long time. Graduated from the University of Minnesota, had a PhD in Renaissance history or something.
Wow.
But I don't know what he taught at Tuskegee. But anyway, we hired him, and of course, they immediately had him teach black history.
Wow.
Of course, but he taught other things too.
Huh.
But we became the best of friends. He and his wife. The families, and we would go down there and eat supper with them. They would come up here and eat supper with us and our family, and we just had the best time. And he died of a brain tumor just within 3 weeks after he came down with it.
I'm so sorry.
We were when he first found out, I was the first person in the history department to know about it. I passed his office, and he hit his head down on his desk in his hands, and I said, "I've got a brain cancer, and I've got 2 weeks to live."
Oh, my word.
And he had been, interestingly, it brings tears to my eyes. I remember him so well. He said, we'd been talking for, I said, "Go on and retire, Bob." I said, you know, you've been here, and you've done well, and you got your years in, and you'll be," he said, "I want to be 65. I want to, and I said, "Go ahead and do it." And,
Wow.
but of course, he died 2 weeks later.
Wow.
But, Alan, don't wait too long. And I said, that was when he, I said, "What's wrong with you?" He said, "Alan, don't wait too long." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "I've got a brain tumor, and I got 2 weeks to live."
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
and so, when I got 60 years old, I retired.
Wow.
And of course, I'm still here. But he was the dearest of friends. And let me go back to another story about the Alabama Historical Association.
Okay.
About the Alabama Historical Association.
Okay.
There was a guy who ran it named Jim Salisbury from Birmingham, a rich real estate man in Birmingham. He had founded it in 1948, and I'd been a member since 1948.
Wow.
Since I got interested in history when I came here as a student and joined it. And I never, during those years, I never thought anything about it. It was all white, and I never even thought about blacks. And anyway, when I came back here to Auburn, I started going back to the meetings. When I was in South Carolina, I didn't go to the meetings. And in the Army, I couldn't go to the meetings. So I hadn't been to meetings in a long time. So I started back participating in the Alabama Historical Association. And I said, "This is interesting. We've integrated the schools, and we're doing this." And so I talked to Dr. McMillan, who's head of the history department, about it, and he said, "Well, Alan, Jim Salisbury is not going to allow that. You get in the Alabama Historical Association for you to nominate. So a person has to have 2 nominations from somebody to get members to get in." And I said, "Well, that's a stupid ass thing." And he said, "Yes, it is. Try to do something about that, do you?" He said, "Well, lots of luck." And I said, okay.
Wow.
So I kept thinking, how am I going to do this? And so I said, so finally I talked to Danny Williams about it, and I said, Danny, I need you. I need to use you, just like other you. I need to use you, just like other white people. I want to use you. And he laughed. You'd have to know, Danny was a wonderful person, wonderful human being.
Wow.
And he laughed and he said, Alan, what do you want? And I said, I want to integrate. And I said, I want to integrate the Alabama Historical Association, and I need you. And he said, I said, would you let me nominate you and get you in? And he said, yeah, I'd love to be in. I said, wonderful. So I'd love to be in. I said, wonderful. So I went back to Mac Miller and I said, Mac, I told Mac Mac was my major professor when I was a student here.
Okay.
And he was almost like my daddy. We were just the best of friends, and we were just the best of friends, and I did all kind of things for him and looked after him and his children and so forth. That this part of his family. But anyway, he said yes. I said we have to have two people, and I said that we have to have two people, and I said I'll write one letter, and if you will write a letter, and we'll nominate Danny Williams and send it in, and no mention of anything else. Well, and he was taken in as a member.
Oh, wow.
Well, nobody knew
that
Danny Williams was black.
Wow.
So the next Alabama Historical meeting, I got Danny. It was down in Mobile. Danny went down. By the way, in Toronto, Canada, we went to. I'll have to tell you a funny story about it. Me and my wife and I went, and Danny went with us. We flew up to Toronto, and we got off the plane, and he went into the airport. He got down on his knees and kissed the ground, and he said, the people in the airport just were astounded, and of course I just broke up laughing. He was just that kind of guy. He was just great. But anyway, we went to Mobile, and I said, now Danny, don't wear your feelings on your shoulder. It's going to be a shock to everybody. It's going to be a shock to everybody. And so he said, okay. So we went in this fancy hotel down in the Battle House, the hotel, and so I was taking Danny around. We were looking at book exhibits and so forth. And I saw Jim Sulsby, the guy. And I saw Jim Sulsby, the guy, over talking to Dr. Macmillan, my professor, my major professor. So I said, okay, Danny, we're going to go over and meet the king of segregation in Alabama.
Oh, wow.
And so we walked up to Macmillan, Danny and I said, Dr. Macmillan, I want you to meet Danny Williams from Tuskegee Institute. And Mr. Sullivan and Jim and Macmillan shook his hand, and I said, Danny Williams, well, boy, he turned white, like he had seen a ghost.
Wow.
And then he stuck his hand out, and he just withdrew it, and he turned around and walked off. I thought, well, that's the end of it. We've broken the ice. That wasn't the end of it.
Wow.
Well, everybody accepted Danny and everything. It was just Sulsby. He had been just outmaneuvered in that. He wrote me, when he got back to Birmingham, he wrote me a letter. I still got it in my files.
Wow.
It's the nastiest letter I've ever read, threatening to sue me. He was all kind of... I wrote him back and I said, I wished you would sue me. It would give me an opportunity to strike a blow of freedom for black people.
Oh, wow.
And I said, please enter suit against me. I'd love to take this to the courts. I never did hear from him again on this. Till later, Macmillan told me about it. dean of the School of Liberal Arts called Mac, said, Mac, I've got a visitor down here, Mr. Jim. He has attacked one of your professors. Of course, I knew the dean, and he said he's attacked Ellie Jones and threatened him, and is wanting me to fire him.
Wow.
And I said, and Macmillan, and I said, and Macmillan said, Macmillan told him on the phone, and I think went down and met with him. I don't think he met with Salisbury, but the Hobbs was very polite and nice to him and sent him back to Birmingham. But I did him and sent him back to Birmingham. But I didn't know that he had tried to get my job.
Wow.
At Auburn. But Macmillan, fortunately, again, another wonderful fellow, who he said, I saved your butt. He said, I saved your butt. And he said, but we can't let things like that happen. And so I never heard any more from it. But I was walking a thin line, and in line, and
wow.
So these are the kind of fights you have to fight, and you have to stand up, and of course I kept students going through and going to Tuskegee. Danny Williams was so good to my graduates going to Tuskegee. Danny Williams was so good to my graduate students. He gave them a key to the archives, so when he was not there, the president had Danny doing all kinds of other things, announcing football games, sent him to Africa for 3 months. So he gave my students keys 3 months. So he gave my students keys. They knew where all the material was to go down and do their research. Linda Hines to go. She and Danny were the best of friends. They just were together all the time down there, and they just so it's together all the time down there, and they just so it's that kind of thing. I attribute Tuskegee. I mark it down as one of the great contributions of associating that. And in fact, when they started looking for a black professor, I told Mac, I said, there's several at Tuskegee, and that's when we've got Bob Reed. Okay. And so you do things that you don't want credit for, and you don't even get credit for, but you plant seeds and they grow.
Yes, sir.
And we as I say, when we were out looking, we had the newspaper projects there in the 1980s, and we found a lot of black newspapers in courthouses, and microfilmed them all, and the black newspapers that y'all have in the archives.
Wow.
And so that's kind of the story of my work, as I say. But the friends I made, like Danny Williams, will live with me forever. And Bob Reed, Irene was Bob Reed's wife, sweetest lady, and after Bob died, she set up a scholarship in the history department.
Wow.
And she even after he died, she came up here and had dinner with us and so forth, and we just stayed in touch, and we would go to Montgomery, and we'd always stop back by there to see her, and it was just a wonderful relationship that we had with these people, and so this made life better.
Yes, sir. Well, it's just you. That's yes, sir. Well, it's just you. It's so impressive just what you've witnessed, and I guess you've already hit on it quite a bit, but I can assume, well, I really can assume, just can't assume that just how much of a transition it probably was, and how you taught history in your classes as taught history in your classes as what was the transition like? Like, I mean, you were going from you trying to incorporate more African American history.
Right. Into the regular U.S. history that I taught. Yeah, my period of time was from to the New Deal, the Progressive era, and all of that. I'm named for Woodrow Wilson.
I was wondering.
My daddy was born in '95, so when he was 20 years old in 1920 after the war. So when I came along in 1930, he named me Woodrow Allen Woodson, 68, 7, 8, 9, somewhere along there. I joined Dr. Parton, an old professor, wanted me to join the Rotary Club, so I joined the Rotary Club. Dr. Parton and he was my professor when I was a student here. I used to take him fishing out to the lake, and so we were the Rotary Club.
Okay.
And when we recruited the first black, I guess it was football player, Owens, a fellow named Owens. What was his name? I remember his first name. Nice young black fella. Jim Foy, after he was admitted, he wasn't the first black student because there was a graduate student in history was the first black student, and that was in '64 before I came back here. But this guy was a basketball player, a football player. And Jim Ford decided to bring him to lunch at the Rotary Club. It was uptown in the motel there. So we went in, and I saw Jim, and the guy was there, and I walked up, and I knew who he was. I knew he was, and I said, "Well, welcome." And Jim was proud to have brought him in. Jim introduced him, and so on. And when Jim got up and introduced him, he sat between me and Jim Foy. And he got up and introduced him. Half of the members got up and walked out.
Oh, wow.
I was just astounded. I could not believe it. Well, I was on a committee of some kind, and there was a thing introduced, maybe with a full colonel, retired Army colonel at the time. There was Colonel Lamar, and it seemed like we got something about integration, a resolution about integration or segregation or something. And the committee voted not to integrate or whatever it was. I remember we had bad arguments, and me and the colonel, we both resigned from the Rotary Club. We quit.
Wow.
I said I can't be a member of this organization if you're going to act like that. And I said I'll not be a part of this thing. And I never went back to the Rotary Club.
Wow.
And so it was a lot of them were professors there, of course, and some of them in the university didn't never like me.
Wow.
Because they knew I had those that were in the Rotary Club.
Wow.
And but things were bad. In the '60s, I'll tell you. And it was we had an English professor, Dr. Budge Breyer. I know where to get him. He was from the north. He was from the north, but he was educated at Vanderbilt, had a PhD, bright, brilliant professor of literature. When Bob Reed and I would get on the elevator, this is why I know it, because I'd have to get down in the morning, Bob be coming in, we'd get on the elevator together.
Wow.
And dried the elevator in the Haley Center up down. We were on the 7th floor. The English department was on the 9th floor. And when Budge Breyer was on the elevator, and we the 3rd floor where we taught, he would get off the elevator. He would not even stay on the elevator with Bob Reed on the elevator. And if we got on the elevator and he was in there, he would get off. It didn't make a difference where it was.
Wow.
I mean, we had some tough professors here who, and it wasn't because you weren't smart and intelligent and had a PhD. These were people that that just didn't like black people.
Wow. Well,
I've grown up at a bad age, so it's so nice for me to see people marching in the streets and doing these things that I can't do anymore.
Yes, sir.
And but there's things we can do, and so that's some of my story. Ask me some more questions now.
Now
I get to talk. Ask me some more questions now.
Now
I get to talking. I get to reminiscing, and it brings back a lot of things that happened in my life.
Well, I know it kind of caught me off guard the first time we talked. You spoke about You spoke about again your time at Tuskegee. I guess when you came back from Korea and you were part of the integration of that. Was it the ambulance?
Yeah. They were X-ray technicians and medical assistants over there. So we had I would say we probably had 150 black soldiers in it, from privates up to lieutenant colonel. I tell you, and a white person there, and so the officers, there were a number of nurses who were lieutenants and captains, and doctors, majors, and captains, and one lieutenant colonel. He was a neurosurgeon. See, black doctors couldn't find places to work, but they could work. They all worked at that. So anyway, I remember one Sunday we were sitting there, and his old white Duck Jones sitting there with all these black officers and so forth. And I remember two events that stuck in my memory. One was Lieutenant Colonel Blassingame, stuck in my memory. One was Lieutenant Colonel Blassingame, was the neurosurgeon.
Wow.
And it was during the George Wallace era. And I said, well, Colonel Blassingame, I said, I guess you're going out next week with me and Colonel Blassingame, I said, I guess you're going out next week with me and vote against George Wallace. I said, thank God, maybe we'll have enough to beat him. And he looked at me and he said, no, Major, I'm not voting against George Wallace. I'm voting for him. And I said, sir? I said, did I hear what you said? He said, yes, you did hear what I said. Why would I want to vote against him? And I said, what? He said, listen to me, young fella. He said, before George was in a motel, I couldn't go into a coffee shop to get something to eat. I couldn't go in a restroom at a filling station. And said, since George Wallace has been on, he said, I love George Wallace. I want him to be in forever. He said, because the more he's in, the better.
Wow.
And I sat there just astounded. I said, well, Colonel, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Well, I guess the more resistance, the more trust.
Wallace, and I voted against Wallace.
Wow.
But the other thing was, one Sunday we were talking about these black nurses. They were talking about all kind of things, and they got to talking about certain racial things, and somebody said, well, they were talking about white people, I mean, not nice things. They were just, and somebody looked up and said, one of the black nurses said, Captain, so far, you don't know what you want to watch what you're saying. And she looked down at me and she said, "Oh, he don't count." He said, "Oh, he don't count. He's just like one of us."
Wow.
I just broke up laughing.
Wow.
And that's the way they kind of consider me. But there was one other incident. I do remember this. There was two incidents, as I'll tell you about. This really do remember this. There was two incidents, as I'll tell you about. This really interesting. They were having riots on campuses and so forth, and they were sitting in offices of the presidents and so on. It had some problems at Tuskegee. Offices of the presidents and so on. It had some problems at Tuskegee Institute about it, and so we had to. They called our unit out and on the weekend, and we had to go down and set up the tents and set up a medical unit in case there was trouble. We'd have a hospital there to evacuate people to. And we were putting up the tents and doing setting up this mobile army hospital, and there was a sergeant, Sergeant Eccles. I'll never will forget Sergeant Eccles. In fact, his wife later became a member of the Auburn City. Sergeant Eccles was a great guy. We were friends, good person, and we always carried on with each other. And so I was out there with one of the tents, and he walked up to me and he said, "Major Jones, I got something for you here, sir." I said, "What is that?" So he handed me a calling card, like a business card. And you know, I've lost the darn thing. I don't know what I ever did with it. I kept it forever, and then some of the moves or somewhere I lost it. It said in big black print, "I am a nigger."
Oh my word.
And at the bottom it said, "Use in the case of a riot."
Oh my word.
I said, and he handed me the card and he walked off. I looked up back and he was just smiling. He was just smiling.
Oh my word.
And I kept that card for long. But there was another thing. There was a young black boy. He was a student at Tuskegee. And he was an arrogant rascal. And there's a PFC. And one day I was down at Tuskegee doing research. I did a lot of research on my historical project, things I was publishing. And I would go over to the cafeteria. There was nothing but blacks there. And they were having planning a riot. They had a megaphone and they were carrying. I sat way over in the corner out of the way and got my lunch. And anyway, at the next reserve meeting, I thought, boy, they had a riot down here. I'm down here doing research. I'd be right in the middle of it. And so I saw, let's see, I forget what his name was. And I said, "Well, I was down here the other day doing research, and I saw y'all." I looked out the window. It was over there in the library. I looked out the window, and they were marching. They were protesting. I don't know what they were protesting. Something on the campus.
Now, was this in the 19...
it was the late 60s.
Late 60s, okay.
Yeah, they had taken over the president's office down there at one point. That was when we set up the hospital. Things were pretty tense. They'd called out the National Guard down there, the military police unit. It was tense times anyway. And anyway, this young fellow, PFC there, and I said, "Well, I was down here doing research the other day. I looked out there and y'all were protesting." And he said, "Uh-huh." I said, "Well, what you thought about if He said, "I'd have beat the shit out of you. That's what I'd have done." God almighty, I turned around and walked off. He didn't like white people. He didn't. And I understand that. You know, I'm a major in his. He didn't. And I understand that. You know, I'm a major in his PFC telling me what. But I knew it was the frustrations of these people, and so there's things like that went on. You had to, there's things like that went on. You had to.
Wow. Well, and
yeah, these things, I haven't recalled many of them until I got to talking to you about it. That's interesting. How you bury these things in the back of your mind.
Yes, sir. Well, I wanted to mention I was very blessed. I don't know if you ever heard of Gwen Patton.
Of what?
Gwendolyn Patton.
No, I have not.
She was actually I think in probably the 2000s back at Trenum at Trenum State here in Montgomery, and she was actually the first SGA president, or female SGA president at Tuskegee, and she was in the riots. And
I was around down there, but I was not involved in it. I was down there doing research and then with my reserve unit.
Wow. Well, I didn't know if you had ever run into her in any professional manner.
No, I never
had ever run into her in any professional manner.
No, I never did. No, I didn't.
Yes, sir. Well, I was just going to mention she passed away a couple of years ago, but it was kind of weird talking about, sort of, it was kind of weird talking about, sort of bridging the skin color gap. I was very blessed to be able to escort her to a lot of meetings, and we were able to talk about these things and just.
Well, I don't know. They had several problems at the institute down there. One time when they took over the president's office and locked him in the office, General May, was an Air Force general, was on the board of Tuskegee down there, and they locked him on. They stewed him out for a day or two.
Wow.
I don't know whether he was involved in that or not. I wasn't down there when that happened. I just.
Wow.
But they took over the president's office.
Yeah, I don't doubt that she was probably involved in that. She was on the forefront. I know you being an archivist, could you go into a little more detail of how you got to that position?
Yes. When I came here, Dr. Drone had just retired from the university. Dr. Philpott had just been appointed president, and it was all in '65, and I came in June of '66. And Dr. Drone, and I came in June of '66. And Dr. Drone set up, they built him an office over in the basement of the library, on the bottom floor, not the basement, the bottom floor.
Okay.
And Dr. Drone, they brought a lot of the president's papers and all this kind of stuff over there for him. He was writing a history of Auburn.
Okay.
And he had written a couple of chapters, I think, before he died. But that was his office. They had the old president that went way back to sometime in the 1920s. And big, beautiful desk. They had old ROTC muskets stacked in the corner that had been used by cadets in the 1870s. And he had his office with the desk and all that. And then he had a back room where he had all the research materials he was using to write a history of Auburn. And so one day, Dr. Parton was a history professor, was coming out of the building, and he saw them. See, at that time, Sanford Hall was the president, where the president's office was, and all the administrative office. But there were also classrooms. We all taught classes on the second and third floor. My office was on the third floor.
Wow.
Classes on the second and third floor. My office was on the third floor.
Wow.
Fourth floor. The fourth floor, I guess. It was up at the top, anyway. And so Dr. Parton, we had an office with him, and so this was before I had an office with him. I had one down the hall, but before I had an office with him, I had one down the hall. But anyway, he was coming. Well, it was before I was coming back. Before I got back, he saw them moving all these records out the back of Sanford Hall. And he stopped them and said, "Don't worry, where y'all going?" They said, "Well, we're taking them to burn them." My God, he was in his 70s when it went.
Wow.
And anyway, he called Dr. Dahl and said, "Ralph, they're about to destroy these records." And so Ralph Braun got upset, and so they moved them all over there to his office. He was really the first archivist they appointed.
Okay.
And so he was supposed to. So they took a room next to in the basement on the second floor. They took a room and made to put all the records in over there that they were taking out of Sanford Hall records.
Wow.
And so that's kind of where it started.
Okay.
And then he kept it for about a year, I guess, a year and a half. And he said, Macmillan kind of just said, "Tom, you got to go over there and look after this stuff." And he didn't want to do it, to go over there and look after this stuff. And he didn't want to do it. He was a Civil War historian. And so he said, "I don't want to do this anymore." And so Mac knew that I had spent 2 years in the state archive. 2 years in the state archives. I had worked down there. I took a whole year off and did research every day. I'd go down there at 5 o'clock in the morning and work until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon every day. And then at 4 o'clock I'd go to work afternoon every day. And then at 4 o'clock I'd go to work microfilming records for the Veterans Affairs.
Wow.
And work till 11 o'clock at night, and then get up the next morning and go back down at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I can tell you some stories about the archives.
Wow. Well, that's...
Anyway, yes.
Wow. Well, that's...
Anyway, that's just how it started. And so Mac said, "Alan, would you take over and run this archives?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do know something about them. I'm not an authority in archives, but I do know how they work. And so I said, "Well, I'll do it for a year or two." And he said, "Okay." So he appointed me. I think it was in 67, 60, I lose track of time. It's somewhere right along there. And so that's when I became, it was 15 quarter hours per professor. Everybody had to teach three classes every quarter.
Wow.
He said, "If you'll take over this and set up this," and by this time Dr. Drone died. And then it was a real mess.
Wow.
And that's when he saw us and see what he's done with all the stuff and so forth. So I said, "Okay," and so the other fellow had hired a woman to work for him to try to make heads tails of what all they were bringing in down there. And so Miss Dixon was her name, and so she was still there. And so I said, "Yeah, I'll do it." So he said, "I'll reduce your load by 1 class every quarter, and so you can do 2 jobs for 1 salary."
Okay.
And so that's how the archives for 1 salary.
Okay.
And so that's how the archives came into existence. The one thing that this fellow did for me and for the university, he had first thing he did when he got down there with those records, he had to run in with a librarian, which was an old codger, named Clyde Cantrell. Everybody despised him.
Wow.
And he was a real SOB. You had to know him. Anyway, he and Belser had a knockdown drag. I can't stay down there. I can't do anything. This librarian is down there telling me what to do and what they want to see everything. And he said, so he and Macmillan went down to the president's office, to Dr. Philpott's office, and said, if you're going to set up this archive, we're going to have to take it out from under the control of the librarian. It's not a library operation, and that's what he's trying to make it into. And so Dr. Philpott said, okay. So he assigned it official archives, independent, and report directly to the president.
Okay.
So by the time I got there, fortunately, I saw all the correspondence of their the fight with the librarian and so forth.
Wow.
And so at that point, the fight with the librarian and so forth.
Wow.
And so at that point, he couldn't come down. See, they had a lot of records that were confidential records.
Yes, sir.
Papers on people and so forth and so on. Student records that were had all the student records that were had all the student records going back to before the Civil War. And so they had all this stuff that they'd taken out of the top of Sanford. All that stuff was in the top of Sanford Hall.
Wow.
And so they began to 100 filing cabinets.
Wow.
Still there with stuff in them.
Wow.
So after I got established there, I hired a records manager. You know what a records manager is, and computer and all that. This is in the 1970s. Set up a program of studying the records all over the campus and telling offices what they could throw away and what they needed to send to the archives. And so but then we expanded this and we began to collect records. The organization was founded in the 1930s and has a yearly reunion. And so we established that in the 1960s and started collecting all their stuff, music and photographs, and that was one of the things. Then we decided to collect agricultural records. Did you happen to know a fellow that worked at the archives named Norwood Kerr?
I did. Yes, sir.
Okay, Norwood's one of my graduate students.
Okay.
He wrote a history of the agricultural experiment station.
Okay.
And so he was a graduate student there, and so I talked him into working on that, and we got a grant, several $100,000 grant to collect agricultural records for the state.
Okay.
And so we collected all kind of around the peanut thing down at Dothan and all kind of records, agricultural records. And we found all kind of plantation records. I went over to Perry County and brought back a whole van full of records of plantation that went back to the 1830s.
Wow.
And a whole van full, and we microfilmed all those records.
Wow.
But a whole van full, and we microfilmed all those records.
Wow.
But Norwood headed that project of the agricultural records that we had, and so he was and wrote his dissertation on that. And then I got him a job in the Department of Agriculture and wrote his dissertation on that. And then I got him a job in the Department of Agriculture in Washington, and he he got up there and wrote another book. And he didn't like Washington, so he stayed 4 or 5 years and then married, and he came back and got a job at the archives. And he was one of my favorite guys. We had a good time together, and but that's the story of how the archives started. And of course, I started in 1972. I was let me go back and tell you just a little something else. When I was in the reserves, if I was ever going to make lieutenant colonel, I had College course for officers that were, most of them were majors and lieutenant colonels. And I graduated from there. But while I was there, they found out I had a PhD and I taught history and so forth. And they said, and so forth. And they said, well, Colonel Jones, I was a lieutenant colonel, I think, at the time. And they said, we need somebody to help. We have created a program here to help. We have created a program here in this office with the University of Kansas, which is only about 60, 80 miles from Fort Leavenworth. And they can get a Master of Military Arts and Sciences degree with taking some courses at Kansas. Master of Military Arts and Sciences degree with taking some courses at Kansas in their political science or history, anyway, their curriculum, and writing a thesis. And we are hiring professors. And so they hired 15. We are hiring professors. And so they hired 15 of us professors, everywhere from California to New York to Florida to Alabama. And so they said, we need a historian. We've got a political scientist, we got a sociologist, we got an economist, we got all the scientists, we got a sociologist, we got an economist, we got all of these things. And you are to direct the theses with 2 military people that we will appoint to each committee and have a master's thesis committee, and you will direct the students that you have.
Wow. And
I said, well, yeah, what does it entail as far as, he said, you'll have to come out here about 3 or 4 times a year for 3 days at a time, fly out here and spend 3 days with these students, and then fly back, and then to get their topic, and then a few months later you'll have to come back after about 3 or 4 months, see how they're doing, and go over everything, and then go back home, and then come back for the final thing of the thesis. So I said, well, that sounds great. That sounds like what I do at Auburn. So I said, yeah, I'll do that. So several years till I retired, I was on the faculty there of the Command and General Staff College, and taught these military officers, most of them majors and lieutenant colonels, and directed their thesis.
Wow.
And they did a lot of things, historical kind of things, and so forth. So they did a lot of things, historical kind of things, and so forth. So that was. But anyway, the point was that I needed a place. I'm telling you things now you don't really understand. Since I didn't have a unit, Since I didn't have a unit, they put me in a place they call a MOB DES unit, a unit which gave me points to participate in, no pay, none of that. But I had to do 2 weeks of active duty.
Okay.
And the faculty out at Fort Leavenworth, there was an opening at the National Archives.
Wow.
An opening for 45 days of active duty. By this time, I'm a full colonel, and that was a lot of money.
Wow.
So I went on. I took a leave for 2 months.
Wow.
And there I met a fella. This was in the 1970s. I met a fella who was a high officer in the National Archives, but he taught I said, I really would like to set up. Well, he said, I have a program that we train archivists, and they do an internship over here, and I teach them classes over at the at American University. So he said, I'll give you all the stuff that I use, all my syllabuses and so forth, and if you want to use that to set up a program at Auburn. And I said, well, yeah. So I came back in 1970 program at Auburn. And I said, well, yeah. So I came back in 1972 and talked to the department into letting me create a program in archival administration.
Okay.
So in 1972, we founded this program, and David Alsterbrook. I don't know where you ever met David Alsterbrook or not.
Yes, sir.
He was my first student. He's the only person that ever founded 3 presidential libraries.
Oh, yes, sir.
He's a pretty significant guy.
Yes, sir.
And really proud of that. He was my first student.
Wow.
And there was a guy at the National Archives up there for 2 months, and he helped me get all the stuff to create a records management program. And so we created a class in the political science department to teach records management. But by this time I had hired a guy from Ohio to do records management for the university. So we set up a records management program. So we did all of that, kind of all this through the 1970s and 80s.
Okay. Well, I do. Hey, to kind of wrap up our interview, because I could listen to you all day, but I mean, you have so much insight, and like I said, I've heard bits and pieces about you over the years, and your newspaper project, and your newspaper project, and even.
Have you heard my story about Dr. Bridges?
Oh, well, yeah, but before you tell me that, I'd like to.
Well, he was a student at Furman University when I taught there.
Well,
he was a student at Furman University when I taught there. I didn't have him in class, but I knew him there. He was. I was only there his freshman and sophomore year, and then I left in June, and he had another 2 years. But he went on to the University. Then I left in June, and he had another 2 years. But he went on to the University of Chicago and got a PhD, and he was working at the Georgia State Archives. And I took my archive students up there, the ones that have been working in the archives, and they did an internship at the Federal Records Center and the Georgia State Archives. And so I knew I renewed my friendship with Ed. He was the assistant archivist to the head archivist there, and was in line to get to card for the old lady who was going to retire in a few years. And when Milo Howard died, he was the archivist in 1980.
Yes,
and so I had a hand in getting the board of trustees at the archives to hire an archivist rather than retire. I said, Ed, why don't you, I called him and said, why don't you apply for this job as head of the archives? And he said, well, Ellen, I'm kind of happy here in Georgia, and I'm in line to, be the head of the Georgia Archives in a few years. And I said, well, this is the one right now. And so I talked to the secretary down there, and she said, yeah, Dr. Bridges is thing. And I called her every day, and so I called her and I said, well, as the board, and said, yes, the board has offered him the job. And I said, yes, the board has offered him the job. And I said, well, wonderful.
Wow.
So I called Ed, and he said, well, Ellen, I just don't know where I want to do this or not. And I said, this is a great opportunity. And he said, I'm wishy-washy. I talked to him. He said, I'm wishy-washy. I talked to him on the phone for an hour, and I said, it's really an opportunity. I told him how bad things were there, and I said, you just really need somebody like you to straighten this thing out. And he said, well. So anyway, I thought, well, he may. So anyway, I thought, well, maybe he'll take it.
Yes, sir.
And I understood why he wanted to stay at Georgia, and so So the next day I called down to the archives, and I said, Miss Sweet, the secretary there, and I said, have you heard from Dr. Bridges? She said, have you heard from Dr. Bridges? She said, yes, we did, and he has turned the job down. He's not going to take it.
Oh, my word.
I said, oh, my God. And she said, yes, so we're kind of sad. And I said, because he seemed like such a nice sad. And I said, because he seemed like such a nice fellow. And he had been down there, I think, for an interview, but he just decided not to do it. So I got back to my office. I went home to lunch. I told my wife, I said, God, dog, I'm so sad. I had a chance to get a real archivist at the clock. And I picked up the phone and I called him. And I said, Ed, Alan, how you doing? I said, I'm mad as a damn wet sitting in. And I said, why in the world have you turned this job down? And well, you know, man, I can tell you all about it and everything. We just really need somebody like you to do this. And I talked till I was blue in the face, and finally I said, well, I sure am sorry, and I just gave up. And I said, hey, you're missing a great opportunity. I said, don't you ever. So I hung up. I went home and cried all night. And so the next day, I thought, well, now I wonder what the hell they're going to do. So about 10 o'clock the next morning, I guess maybe it was close to noon time, I picked up the phone and I called Miss Sweet. I picked up the phone and I called Miss Sweet answered the phone. And I said, well, Miss Sweet, I'm just so sorry that Ed is not coming. And she said, oh, he's coming. I said, no. I just talked to him yesterday afternoon. He's not coming. She said, yes, sir. He's called this morning and he's not coming. She said, yes, sir. He's called this morning and he's coming. I said, what?
Wow.
I called in back and I said, you know, I ought to shoot you, but I'm so happy and I'm so proud you're coming. And so that was so happy and I'm so proud you're coming. And so that was the story of his deciding to come to and for 30 years he's done a marvelous job. That's probably the best thing I ever did for the state of Alabama, was to talk that boy into coming to head the archive. He's just done. I can't tell you what the archives is when he came there and what it is today. Oh my God.
Yes, sir. Well,
it's unbelievable. Just unbelievable.
Well, I probably need to.
Just unbelievable.
Well, I probably need to wrap up our interview right now. I'd love to talk more.
Okay, well, I understand. You get me started, and I don't know when to stop.
Oh, no. And the thing is, I guess, you know, it's amazing, you know, to African American history. Ed Bridges, he told me once he was actually a student of John Hope Franklin.
That's right. Yes, he was. I knew that. Yeah.
And
we had John Hope Franklin here to the history department. I helped get him down here did a lecture for the history department. He's really a great guy.
Wow.
Great guy.
Well, it's so, you know, you've done so much. Just a quick question. I know there have been other organizations like the Alabama State Teachers Association, and I know they joined GAY back in 1969, and of course there's been the Black Heritage Council and other black organizations that have tried to help preserve or have taken on the role of preserving black history in the state. Did you ever work with any of those organizations? History in the state. Did you ever work with any of those organizations?
No, I didn't. I did. I was with the Southern Historical Association and various historical organizations, but I never worked with the education associations. The only thing I had to do was here in Auburn was associations. The only thing I had to do was here in Auburn was to work with this committee that the mayor set up to integrate for us to see we could integrate the schools.
Okay.
And that was the only thing I ever did was except teach. I'd go out and teach a history class at the high school occasionally, but I didn't have much to do with the secondary education.
Yes, sir. Well, I have to say your life has just been remarkable, and there's so much more to say, so we may have to do a second episode.
Well, if you've got some questions, I'm here most every day, and so I can stop what I'm doing and answer your questions.
Yes, sir. Well,
I'm sure I'll think of a lot of other things after I hang up, but you got me started.
Yes, sir. Well, good. Well, you need. I can imagine probably a quite a thick volume on your life, I would think. But,
well, this is the second in-depth interview I've kind of done. I did one for about 6 hours with another lady, but it was just about life as a whole and so forth. And
well,
life as a whole and so forth. And
well,
it won a graduate student of pride. My 6-hour interview with her.
Wow. Well, great. Well, again, I really want to continue our conversation, so hopefully maybe another episode, but we want to continue our conversation, so hopefully maybe another episode, but I may go ahead and wrap up this one.
Okay.
Did you...
Well, you just call me if you got some more questions when you listen back to it, or whatever you're going to do. If there's something you want to know, I may know and I may not.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and do a little end monologue. Thanks for listening to another episode of From the Grassroots. If you would like to, as the YouTube and Facebook pages, this project's still growing and finding its footing, but you can assist in promoting Black history in your community, and if you'd like to become a patron, please check out the Digital Grassroots Patreon site.